Hello everyone, this is Chris from Pain and Glory here with a follow-up video for my So You Want to Start Historical Miniatures Wargaming, and today we're going to be talking about a particular time period and how you can get started gaming in that time period. That is ancient time period. We're talking pretty much any time period up to around 400 AD or CE, however you want to call it. And specifically, we're going to be looking at playing ancients in the 15mm scale. That's a nice medium scale that I think is really good, especially for skirmish games. Now, why should you play ancients? There's a huge variety of nations. That might not be the proper term for it in the ancient period, but you have so many different nations that you can cover in the ancient period. Ancient Greece, all the various Greek city-states. You have the Macedonians. You have all the wars fought by Alexander the Great against Persia, against India. You have the successor states of Alexander the Great, like the Parthian Empire and the Ptolemaic Egyptians. You have the rise of Rome and all of the other Italian peoples. You have the eventual Caesar's invasion of Gaul, his conquest of Gaul, his invasion of Britain. You have the Roman civil wars. You have the Roman Empire. You have the Germans. You have the various societies of the Middle East and North Africa. You can extend ancient warfare out into the Far East, although that is not my area of expertise, such as the Three Kingdoms period of China. And so there's just a huge variety of miniatures. There's a huge variety of unit types, infantry, light infantry, heavy infantry, skirmishers, archers, slingers, cavalry of every shape and size, elephants. There's just so much variety in ancients, where when you get into some of the more modern periods like Napoleonics, most of your figures are going to be guys in uniforms with muskets, people on horses with swords. In modern periods, people in uniforms with guns, some sort of mechanized tanks. Ancients, you have tons of variety, tons of color, lots of affordable options in terms of miniatures, and it's a fairly popular time period in historical, so there are going to be a lot of players that you can play against. Now, I'm going to focus on two particular rule sets that are really good for people to play skirmish in, and that is Infamy by Two Fat Lardies, which is a rule set published by Two Fat Lardies. They don't make miniatures. It costs either 16 or 26 pounds, depending on whether you're getting the PDF or the physical rule book. And it's right now, it's one of three books. The first book very specifically covers the time period that you could see there on the cover, 60 BC to AD 100. That's the late Roman Republic, Caesar and Gaul and Britain, the Roman civil wars of Caesar and Pompey, and Octavian Augustus and Mark Antony, etc. The early Roman Empire, Britain, Gaul, Germania. Really just that. It doesn't cover really any other areas. It doesn't cover the Punic Wars. It doesn't cover the Roman Empire in the East. It's really just focused on that. But there are going to be more books that are going to cover the rise of Rome, such as the Punic Wars or the Pyrrhic Wars, and also Rome in the East against the enemies such as the Parthians and eventually the Seleucids and the other enemies of Rome in the eastern area of the Roman Empire. You also have maybe a little more accessible SPQR. Now, this is a game by Warlord Games. You can see their starter set here. The starter set, they actually are literally just re-releasing. It has been out of print for a while. It's $60 for about 70 figures. It's 16 Romans plus a leader, and it's 52 Gauls or Celts plus against a leader. And SPQR covers a wider time period. It covers ancient Greece, the ancient Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta and Thebes, Alexander the Great, Macedonia, the successor states. It covers the late Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire, just like Infamy, and all of their enemies. There's a big hole in this, however, is that it kind of jumps from Alexander the Great and the successor states to the late Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire, while completely skipping the rise of Rome with the Punic Wars and Carthage and that mid-Roman Republican era. Not that you couldn't play that era with these rules, you would just kind of have to come up with your own lists. So these are both excellent rule sets. They're both default to 28 millimeters, and in theory, your number of figures per side, if we're talking about really mostly infantry, is going to be between 50 and 80 figures. So with 28 millimeter plastic figures from, say, Warlord Games or other manufacturers like Victrix, that could run you between $50 and $100 per army, not counting the cost of the rules. So that's not a ton of money, but if you are just starting out and you want to save some money, or if you are looking to do both sides of a conflict, maybe the Romans and the Gauls, or two different Roman forces plus some allies. So you could do Caesar versus Pompey along with some allied forces that were fighting alongside them during those civil wars. You're going to want to save some money, and also that's going to take up a lot of space. The figures take up space in 28 millimeter. Each 28 millimeter figure probably takes up about 1 square inch of storage space. And then also the terrain is really going to take up a lot of space. The trees, the hills, the small ancient buildings, they're going to take up space. If you play in 15 millimeter, you can save some space. I have another video about playing a World War I game called Blood and Valor in 15 millimeter. I'll link to that in the description below. And that tells you some more of the advantages of playing in 15 millimeter. Now, what I'm going to recommend is 15 millimeter in plastic. And if you're a veteran wargamer, you might know there aren't a lot of 15 millimeters in plastic. There's a lot of World War II 15 millimeter in plastic, but outside of World War II, there's really not that much 15 millimeter in plastic. And just for a price comparison, plastic 28 millimeter infantry cost approximately $1 per model. Plastic 15 millimeter infantry, it says 50 cents per model. That's actually, I think, a conservative estimate. It's probably more like 30 or 40 cents per model. It depends on the manufacturer. While metal 15 millimeter infantry, it varies by manufacturer, but could easily be 75 cents or even $1 per model. So the 15 millimeter isn't really saving you much money. But there is a company that has within the last year started releasing some ancient sets in plastic. It's actually a new kind of a resin plastic hybrid. And that's the aptly named Plastic Soldier Company based out of the UK. And so they have a series of sets that are marketed under the Mortem et Gloriam, or MEG series. They go with a set of rules. You don't have to use them with those rules, of course. And they are, as far as I'm aware, the only plastic 15 millimeter ancient figures available anywhere. And they have a number of starter sets that cost, they're about 40 pounds, so approximately $50 or $55. Exchange rate varies, and you can also get them for a discount depending on where you're buying from here in the United States. So I'm going to be taking a look at a few of their starter sets, plus a couple of expansion packs that are going to get you started playing either SPQR by Warlord Games or Infamy by Two Fat Lardies, which are very similarly sized games. Again, you're looking for about 50 to 80 figures. You could play with less. You absolutely can play with less, but that's how much you're going to want if you really want the full experience of the game. So we're going to be looking at the early Imperial Roman set and the Gallic set, both of which are going to do a little bit of double duty. So the early Imperial Roman set has got a lot of stuff in it. You've got mounted command figures, so we're talking like a general, a bodyguard, a standard bearer. You have foot command figures that would be like a general or a centurion, again, a standard bearer, a musician. You have veteran legionaries, you have regular legionaries with pilum, you have auxiliary infantry, also with the gladius sword, and they're going to be wearing mail instead of the kind of the metal armor that the other Romans wear. And you do have some cavalry in there. You have 12 auxiliary cavalry as well. So this is, it's got no ranged option. It doesn't have slingers. It doesn't have archers, but this is a very well-rounded early Imperial Roman starter set that could cover you. As if you're playing SPQR, which is a point buy system, it doesn't really give you any requirements in terms of what kind of figures you have to buy. This is, according to the SPQR version 1 rules, about 1,900 denarii, and that's not even counting a lot of upgrades like buying the pilum, the javelins for the Roman legionaries. And so I have heard that in SPQR version 2, they're going to make Romans less expensive, so they're a little more affordable, but still, 1,900 denarii, or even if you scale that down to say 1,500 denarii, that is more than enough to play SPQR with just the set and have a very representative Roman force. No allies, but you could, of course, always get some allies, and we'll talk about that later. If you do want some enemies for your Romans, we can go with the Gauls starter set. Now, this starter set can represent either the Gauls of Gaul, modern-day France, or the Celts of Britain, because they were a related people. They fought very similarly. Their style of warfare was very similar with some exceptions, so I'll talk about the difference between those in a little bit. It comes with, again, mounted command, some foot command. It comes with naked fanatic infantry. They go into battle completely naked with sword and shield or spear and shield. Some regular warriors that you can see in that picture there. some noble cavalry that are wearing mail, some unarmored cavalry, and then some slingers and javelins. So a little more versatile in terms of a wide variety of units than the Romans, but less heavily, their warriors are going to be less heavily armored and less well drilled than the Romans. In SPQR, this is about 1,400 denarii for the Gauls and a little less for the Britons, because the Briton cavalry is not as good and thus it is worth less points. And also the British cannot use the noble cavalry because the Britons did not have mail armor. You can also then very easily pick up some more slingers and light cavalry. There's a box for that, as well as chariots, because the British can't use chariots, but that is in another box. Now, these are the two primary boxes, but I'm also going to be talking about this third box a lot, and that is the Carthaginian starter army. Now, both of these games do not currently support Carthage. So this is not going to be a box that you want to buy to use on its own unless you are okay kind of modifying the rules on your own. But Carthage was famous for using a lot of allied client state soldiers. And so if you look at the contents of the Carthaginian box, you have some mounted generals, and you can see those in the pictures, and they're actually fairly generic. They have a beard, so maybe it wouldn't fly as a Roman general, but they could easily serve as generals for other nations. And then you have African spearmen, not pictured in either of these. But then after that, you have Gallic or Iberian warriors. These are Celt or Celto-Iberian warriors pictured in the bottom. They're wearing mail armor. They have slightly pointed helmets, and then they have this Scutarii shields and spears. So these could really serve as either Spanish warriors, or at the time Iberian, or these could serve as warriors in Gaul as well. So you could use them to expand your Gaul force. You could use them as allies of the Romans, Gallic tribal allies. You've got Punic cavalry, and you have Spanish cavalry. To be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure which is which up in the top picture. I think the Spanish cavalry on the left with the smaller shields and the Punic cavalry on the right with the larger shields. But again, I'm really not 100% sure. So you could use either of those as allied cavalry for the Romans or allied cavalry for the Gauls. And then you have Numidian cavalry, which the Romans used in some of their forces, especially during the late Republic. So I'll have to show pictures of those later. So these are the three forces that I'm going to be talking about, mostly the Romans and the Gauls, but then also the Carthaginians kind of are a good set that you could split up and use as allies for both forces. Now, if you're playing SPQR, really you could just buy the Roman starter set and the Gallic starter set and be ready to go. And maybe you pick up a couple of other smaller boxes to mix things up. But if you want to play Infamy, it uses a different system. It doesn't use a straight point buy system where it says, oh, I want to buy a unit of legionaries, that's 100 points. I want to buy a unit of archers, that's 80 points. And you play a 1,000-point game. Infamy uses uses core historically informed army lists. So you decide, it's more of a narratively based game. You decide you and your opponent want to do Caesar's conquest of Gaul. And so you pick army lists that are the Caesar conquest of Gaul on the Roman side, and then the Gallic force that would roughly correspond with that time period. And then from there, you can select supporting units from support lists and add them to your core force, and you can build out a really mostly historically accurate force for that time period. And so I have 6 different Roman lists, and then I also have 6 different Gallic or British lists. Actually, I think it's 7. Plus there are in Infamy German lists. Now I'm going to skip the German list because I don't really have German figures in plastic, although there are solutions to that, which I will talk about. But I'm primarily going to focus on the Gauls and the Britons, and then the Romans. So let's start with the late Republican Romans. And there is actually a problem with the late Republican Romans, and that is historical armor. Late Republican Romans did not wear the Lorica Segmentata armor that is pictured on the right. The Lorica Segmentata was not adopted by the Romans really until the early imperial period. Late Republican Roman armor was mail armor for the most part. And so the figures in the early imperial set, as you could probably guess because it is called the early imperial set, they wear early imperial Lorica Segmentata armor on most of their figures, except for the auxilia. The auxilia wear mail. And so if you are playing a late Republican list using these figures, they are not going to pass close inspection if you want to be truly historically accurate. If you don't mind, that of course does not matter, and it makes your figures a little more versatile. But just know that these figures are wearing Lorica Segmentata, so it might not look perfectly historically accurate. Now here I have 3 lists for the late Republican Rome series. So first is Caesar in Gaul or Caesar in Britain. This is a force that focuses mostly on legionaries with some support from Gallic allies, some slingers and some cavalry from the Gauls. So I would say pick up the early Imperial Roman starter army. That gives you pretty much all the legionaries you're going to need. Plus, you can bring in extra legionaries as support. You can bring in that Roman cavalry as support. And then also buy a small box of British skirmishers, which comes with 8 cavalry. You can see some of them up top. They're kind of light skirmish cavalry, not really a lot of armor there. And there's 8 in that box. You only need 6. So you have a couple of extra. You could maybe make one of them your leader, your Gallic leader. And then it's also going to give you 16 slingers. Now you only need 6 of them, so you can have a lot left over. You could bring in another unit of them. So that would work out really well. Or if you want, you could just buy an entire box Gallic starter army, and then you could mix in some of those Gauls, and they could be allies of Rome. And the rest of them could be enemies of Rome. And so you could mix it up there. The next list is the Romans plus their Numidian allies, the Numidians being peoples who used to be a client state of Carthage, but after the fall of Carthage became a client state of Rome, and they were famous for their light Numidian cavalry skirmishers. So this is going to be an early Imperial Roman starter set plus the Carthaginian starter army, which gives you lots of Numidian cavalry. Unfortunately, Plastic Soldier Company doesn't produce any foot Numidian skirmishers with javelins or slings. And so for that, you're going to need to go outside of Plastic Soldier Company. The ones that I pictured on the top of the screen, those are from the Forged in Battle Company. 1 box of those is going to give you 8 slingers and 16 javelins. You can kind of mix them together. So unfortunately, this is one of the few lists that you simply cannot really do with just the Plastic Soldier Company figures. Now, I will really quickly point out that the Gallic starter army does come with 4 javelin men, which if you painted them up, you could say they're Numidians. They wouldn't really pass close inspection, but you could do that and it would save you some money. But if you really want to have Numidian figures, then you'd have to look outside. The last Roman Republican force is the Rome and Iberian allies. So we're bringing in the allies from Spain. For this, you are going to need a lot of legionaries, about 24 of them, plus some Iberian cavalry and some Iberian light infantry, the Catrati, and some slingers. So for this, you're going to kind of need a mix of a lot of different things. The early Imperial Roman starter army and the Carthaginian starter army, because the Carthaginian starter army is going to give you the Iberian cavalry and the Iberian Celtic warriors. Unfortunately, the Iberians that this list calls for are the Catrati. They are really more the light infantry of Iberia, whereas the ones in the Carthaginian box are the Scutarii, the heavy infantry of Iberia. Not going to pass close inspection, but it should, if you don't care, that's okay. And then for the slingers, you are going to have to buy a box of British skirmishers. So this is really going to give you a lot of variety that you could play with, but it is going to be a little bit more on the expensive side because of all of these different boxes you need to buy, because this is such a varied list with Romans and Spanish and slingers and etc. Moving on to the early Roman Empire, these are actually going to be a lot simpler to buy, and also because the box matches the time period, the Lorica Segmentatum is going to match here, and it will actually pass historically accurate inspection. So first we start with just a simple Imperial Legion army. It's mostly legionaries, 24 of them, plus some leaders, and then some auxiliary foot, which there are auxiliary foot in the Roman box. The only thing that doesn't come in that early Roman starter army is some auxiliary archers. There is a box of auxiliary archers that you can buy. It comes with 32 auxiliary archers in both the Eastern and Western form, the Western being pictured here with the pants, while the Eastern form wore kind of like a long skirt tunic. And so those two things are going to build you a nice, solid Roman Imperial Legion. Now, if you go a little further afield, you're going to be fielding armies of auxiliary, and these are the auxiliary cohort that are on foot. So you'd go for an early Imperial Roman starter army, and then on top of that, you'd actually buy a late Imperial Roman armored infantry box. Now, the late Roman Empire moved towards spear-based infantry. They dropped the Loricum Segmentata in replacement of mail. And these are not going to be technically historically accurate, but the problem is auxiliary troops did not wear the Lorica Segmentata. They were male for the most part. And so these spear-based male units from the late Roman Empire actually are fairly close in appearance to the early Roman Empire's auxiliary foot troops. Plus, it gives you the archers you need for this unit. So you could buy those two boxes, and then you could have a solid mix of legionaries that you could bring in, plus a lot of troops that are auxiliaries, plus some archers. If you wanted, you don't have to buy the late Imperial Roman armored infantry. You could just use the early Imperial Roman armored archer box. But then a lot of your auxiliary foot are going to be wearing Loricum Segmentata, which is not as historically accurate. Not the end of the world, but again, not going to pass super close muster. The final early empire from Infamy is a Equitata cohort, which means that's the auxiliaries with horse. And so here I'm actually going to recommend pretty much the exact same thing, a early Imperial Roman starter army, which gives you enough auxiliary cavalry. It gives you 12. You actually need 12, so you're perfect. And then you could also buy a late Imperial Roman armored infantry, which gives you the archers you need. It gives you more of those spearmen with the mail that are going to be the auxiliary figures. And so with those two boxes, you could do an Equitata cohort, or you could do a foot cohort of auxiliaries, plus you still have a lot of legionaries to bring in, and buying that armored infantry box is not going to be as much as buying a whole starter box. It's only going to cost you about 12 pounds, so maybe $18. Now onto the enemies of Rome, the Gauls. And the Gauls are going to be good enemies whether you are fighting as the Roman late Republic under, say, Caesar, or the Roman early Empire under Augustus or some of the other early emperors. The Gauls, of course, mostly conquered by Caesar, but there's still outliers. There are rebellious tribes that could be fought. And so with the Gauls, we're of course mostly going to be starting from the Gallic starter army. These are the Gauls and Aquitani, kind of the southern Gauls. And then I would also recommend bringing in that Carthaginian starter army, because the Carthaginian starter army is going to give you more armored cavalry. This list calls for 12 noble cavalry. The Gallic starter army only gives you 6 armored cavalry and a bunch of unarmored cavalry. So the Carthaginian starter army is going to give you some other armored cavalry that you could say are nobles. It's also going to give you the armored Gallic warriors with the mail shirts and the Scutarii shields. So those could be your noble warriors, while you use the unarmored warriors from the Gallic starter army as your warriors or tribal levies for this list. You are going to be short 2 slingers if you go with the Carthaginian starter army and the Gallic starter army. Those 2 boxes only give you 4 slingers. You technically need 6, but you could just mix them some javelin men and call it a day. Or instead of the Carthaginian starter army, you could just buy 2 Gallic starter armies. It's going to give you all the Gauls you'll ever need. And then you could also maybe split that second Gallic army with your Roman opponent. You buy 3 boxes, a Roman box, 2 Gallic boxes, split one of the Gallic boxes, and then you've got Gauls versus Rome plus Gallic allies. Next is going to be the Belgae. These are the Gauls of, say, Northern Gaul, modern-day Belgium. And I'm pretty much going to recommend the exact same thing. Compared to the last list, this has more infantry, but less cavalry. In fact, there are no cavalry in this list, but you need so many infantry. You need 60 in general. You need 10 noble warriors, 30 warriors, and 20 tribal warriors, light levy warriors, that one Gallic starter box is simply not going to cut it. So bringing in a Carthaginian starter army gives you some variety, but probably I would recommend here go with the that second Gallic starter army. Although you won't have the Gallic armored warriors, it'll be a little more matchy, and you won't be stuck with a bunch of figures you can't really use, like the African spearmen or the Numidians or etc. So again, they'll look more of the same, but you'll have more usable figures. The last army of the Gauls is, I'm going to pronounce this, Vercingetorix's army. And for him, his force is very varied. It's got a leader, 2 leaders. It's got noble cavalry. It's got lighter tribal cavalry, which are still covered by the Gallic starter army. They don't have armor. You have noble warriors, you have regular warriors, you have tribal warriors, and you have the first appearance of archers in the Gauls. Archers were not that common in the Gauls. And for this, I'm going to recommend, this is actually probably the cheapest you can go. the Gallic starter army plus Gothic warriors and archer infantry, which is about 12 pounds, and it gives you 24 warriors and 8 archers. This is perfect because you can see the Gallic warriors have a different look. I'm sorry, the German warriors, the Goths, have a different look from the Gauls. They have the round shields, they have different helmets, they have axes, they have spears. And so you could say that those Gothic warriors are going to give you a little more variety. You could say that they're your nobles. They're more heavily armed and armored. You have those archers, you get 8 of them, you need 6 of them. And so this is probably the cheapest way to play the Gauls. And it's going to give you some variety in bringing in the Goths. Not 100% historically accurate, but it should pass the squint test. It also lets you bring in, if you were playing the Belgians have access, because they're so close to the German border, the Belgians have access to a lot of German mercenaries. And so you can bring in the Goths as the Germans. Unfortunately, the Goths were a tribe that really didn't show up until the 300s or 400s AD, and we're playing in an earlier time period, but again, it will pass the squint test. Finally, we have the Britons, being the Celtic people of the British Isles, related to the Gauls. So we're going to be using the same Gallic starter army. And then for the Southern Tribal Warband, we're looking at also a box of light chariots. What is a British army without chariots? Because everyone else abandoned chariots at this point, but not the Britons. And so we're going to be bringing them in as well. The next army is going to be exactly the same. That's the combined army of the Britons. The specifics of the list are a little different, but it's still easily covered by a Gallic starter set plus the light chariots. The next British list is going to be the same. It's the Iceni and Trinovantes. Again, the numbers, the specific numbers required change a little bit, but the boxes really don't. And finally, there is actually a 4th British list, and that is Calgacus and the Men of the North. And this is actually such a huge list, it actually requires 2 Gallic starter armies, plus the light chariots. So this is the only one that requires more. You simply need too many Gauls. I haven't mentioned this, but unfortunately right now, the Gallic infantry are not available separately from the Gallic starter army. They might be in the future. You are seeing this, I'm recording this in February 2021. So in the future, you might be able to buy some extra Gallic warriors without buying an entire new starter army. But as of right now, you can't do that. All right, now, a couple of other things. In Infamy, you can buy support options in addition to those core lists. I usually agree upon a point value. The core lists are somewhere in the 90 to 110, 120 points. And then if you're playing a 150-point game, you could bring in some support options. So here's are some of the support options that you can have in Infamy for the various Romans and Gauls, and a little bit of the Germans too, we'll talk about. And then here are some of the other Classic Soldier Company sets, starter boxes for other armies, and also some of the separate sets that we didn't talk about, unlike, say, the chariots, which got mentioned. We'll talk about some of those others. So first we have the early Imperial Roman Scorpion, which is their kind of a siege weapon, or like a heavy, it's not a crossbow. Wait, some of them fired bolts, some of them fired rocks. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's a siege weapon. This comes in a 2-pack. I believe. So you could buy that if you were playing the Romans. Next is the late Imperial Rome starter army. Now, this is not going to be historically accurate, but it does offer a lot of variety. So this comes with some Equites alares. Those you could use as a variety of allied cavalry, and also the Equites Sagittarii, the horse archers. So those could be used as some horse archers. There are no horse archers in Infamy as of right now, but there are horse archers in SPQR. So if you're interested in some of those, you could bring those in. There's also the armored infantry that we already talked about. Those could be used as auxiliaries. And there's also unarmored infantry on the bottom right. Those could be very useful as allied tribal infantry or armed villagers. So you could use those as some of the support options in Infamy or SPQR. And then there's just some plain unarmored archers that you could use there on the bottom left. So even if you're not playing a late Imperial Roman army, because that's not in either of these games, these figures are still going to be useful to you. There are a couple of figures in here that you won't be able to use, like the Cataphract, the super heavily armored Cataphract cavalry, but that's only a handful of figures in the whole box. Most of them can be useful to you. Up next is the Goth army. Now, we talked very briefly about the Goth warriors and the Goth archers pictured on the bottom, but the Goth starter box comes with warriors and archers, and it also comes with armored and unarmored cavalry. Now, the armored cavalry is of that heavy cataphract type. They were influenced by the Eastern armies like the Sassanids, and so that's not going to be useful in either of these games, but that's only 6 figures. Most of the cavalry in the Goth starter set are the unarmored cavalry that you see in the top right with the round shields and the spears. So that could be very useful as allied cavalry of various tribes that are allied to the Gauls or the Romans. And so you could bring in this unarmored cavalry as, say, if you're playing the Gauls, just say, oh, these are allies from a neighboring tribe. That's why they don't look exactly like us. Same with the Romans. You're bringing in allies that are technically Goths, but you just say they're Gauls, and then you're facing off against the Gauls, and you've got a variety of figures on the table, and they don't all look exactly the same. Same with the warriors and the archers. So these can be useful to both the Gauls and the Romans. You could split a box of Goths and give yourself some variety. Could also still call them German, even if they don't really match. That is the other use of Goths, is they are a Germanic people, but they are Germanic people a couple hundred years later than the time periods of these games. And so the armored cavalry don't fit. Again, they're cataphract, fully armored horse cavalry. Whereas the rest of these, they pass the squint test if you want to say that they're Germans. Both of these games have Germanic lists. I didn't go over them just because there aren't proper German figures, but if you want to play Germans in Infamy, or SPQR, a box of Goths would get you pretty much the full way. And then maybe steal some of the Celtic naked fanatics. Now we have the Sassanid Persians. There is a Sassanid Persian starter box, but I would avoid it, and I would buy either just a box of unarmored horse archer cavalry if you're looking for horse archers, or if you're just looking for a little bit of variety in your slingers and your skirmishers, there is a box of just archers and slingers that are fairly generic looking. So that could work to flesh out some of your skirmishers. Either if you're the Romans or the Gauls, you could bring these in as allies. And then finally, this is not Plastic Soldier Company figures, but this is a really, really budget way of starting historical miniature ancients wargaming. It just requires a $200 to $300 upfront investment, and that is a resin 3D printer. There is a Kickstarter that is over, but there is currently late pledging up until, I believe, March 15th-ish. I will link it in the description below, and that is March to Hell Rome. I have no connection to them other than I am a happy backer of them. They offer both 28mm scaled prints and 15mm prints, and the resin cost is less than 5 cents a figure, so very affordable. These are just the base armies in the Kickstarter. And of course, once you buy the files, you can print them as many times as you want. So you have an Imperial Roman army on the left, and you have a British or Gallic army over on the right. The only thing that the Gauls wouldn't use is the chariots. So this pretty much covers everything we did, but then it also has figures for the Germans, Carthage, a number of other allies and enemies of Gaul and Rome. It has extra figures for Gaul and Rome that aren't pictured in these. These are just the originals. Those are stretch goals. And then on top of that, you also have the Republican Romans and the Punic Wars. There's a couple of Parthians mixed in there. So that if you got this Kickstarter, you could pretty much play SPQR or Infamy with all the figures you'd ever need if you printed them yourself for very, very cheap. Now, that's very cheap for a figure. It ignores the $300-ish upfront cost of the printer plus the other equipment. So this is not for people who are brand new to miniatures. This is for people who are brand new to historical wargaming, but maybe already comfortable with 3D printing. All right, that is everything for today, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. I am planning on doing more videos like this in the future that are going to cover other popular time periods, such as World War II, the Napoleonics, things like that. So let me know what you want the next time period to be, and you all have a good day.